Imagine Russia in the winter of 1918. Not the Russia of golden domes and imperial balls, not the Russia of Tolstoy's drawing rooms or Chekhov's cherry orchards. This is a Russia on fire from the inside. The old world has not just collapsed, it has been detonated. The Tsar is gone. The empire that had stood for 300 years has dissolved like sugar in boiling water. In its place, chaos, hunger, and a civil war that will consume millions of lives before it is done. Cities are half empty, roads are frozen. The air itself smells of ash and gunpowder and something harder to name. The raw, terrifying electricity of a world being remade from scratch without blueprints, without guarantees, without mercy. Into this world steps a young man of 25. He's lean, fine-featured, with the bearing of someone who was born into privilege and has spent years training his body to forget it. His name is Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky. He's the son of an aristocratic family. He graduated from the Alexandrovskoye military school in 1914 and was commissioned into the prestigious Semyonovsky Guards Regiment, one of the oldest and most distinguished units in the entire Imperial Army. By all logic, by all the laws of his class and his blood, he should have been on the other side of this war. He should have been with the whites, the officers who wore the old uniforms, who prayed for the restoration of the old order, who believed that everything the Bolsheviks were doing was an abomination. He was not with the whites, and understanding why is the first key to understanding everything that follows. The 5 escapes, before we reach that choice, we must understand the man who made it. The story of Tukhachevsky does not begin in Moscow or Petrograd. It begins in a Bavarian prisoner of war camp somewhere along the cold stretch of the Danube in the middle of the First World War. In February of 1915, Tukhachevsky was captured by the Imperial German Army on the Eastern Front. He was 22 years old. For most officers, capture meant the end of the active war. A kind of waiting, letters home, card games, hunger, and boredom. An agreement, unspoken but universally understood, that the prisoner would endure captivity with a certain resigned dignity until the conflict resolved itself. Tukhachevsky made no such agreement. He escaped once, he was caught. He escaped again, he was caught again. He escaped a third time, a fourth. The Germans, initially irritated, began to regard this particular young Russian with a mixture of frustration and something close to reluctant admiration. After his 5th escape attempt, they had seen enough. He was transferred to the Ingolstadt fortress in Bavaria, a facility specifically designed for prisoners who refused to accept the reality of their captivity. The incorrigibles, the ones who would not be contained. Inside the walls of Ingolstadt, Tukhachevsky is believed to have shared quarters with a young French officer who would later become one of the most consequential figures of the 20th century, Charles de Gaulle. Whether the two men spoke at length, whether they argued about military strategy in the freezing corridors of that Bavarian fortress, whether they recognized in each other the same restless, dangerous intelligence, history does not record with certainty, but the image holds a strange poetic power. 2 future architects of modern warfare, 2 men who would spend their careers rethinking how armies move and fight and win, sitting together in captivity, waiting for a world that had not yet been built. Tukhachevsky finally escaped for the 5th and final time in late 1917, just as Russia was swallowing itself whole. He made his way back across a continent in collapse. He arrived home not as a defeated prisoner, not as a broken man, but as someone who had spent 2 years under impossible pressure and emerged harder, sharper, and more purposeful than before. The choice that cannot be undone. By the winter of 1918, the question was simple and brutal. Which side? The answer was not simple at all. For a man of Tukhachevsky's background, noble blood, imperial commission, the Guards Regiment, the natural answer was the whites. General Denikin, General Kolchak, General Wrangel. These were men of his class, his training, his world. They spoke his language, literally and figuratively. They represented continuity, tradition, the restoration of an order that had made men like him. But Tukhachevsky looked at the white armies, and he saw something the white officers refused to see. They were going to lose. This was not a sentimental assessment. It was not a political conversion. He did not suddenly discover a passion for Marxist theory or a burning desire for the dictatorship of the proletariat. The historians who have studied him most closely are consistent on this point. Tukhachevsky's decision to join the Bolsheviks was an act of cold, calculating strategic intelligence. The whites were fragmented. Multiple factions, multiple commanders, multiple agendas, separated by vast distances with no unified command. The Bolsheviks had a center. They had a single party, a single ideology, a single apparatus of control. In a war decided by discipline, logistics, and will, the side with a center would eventually defeat the side without one. Beyond that, the Bolsheviks were offering something that the old empire had never managed to articulate: the idea of a strong, modern, centralized Russian state, not the Russia of aristocratic privilege and religious hierarchy. A new Russia, a Russia of science, industry, mass armies, and technological power. For a man who had spent 2 years in a German fortress thinking about military strategy, that vision was irresistible. This was not a choice made with the heart. It was, as the plan states with perfect precision, a choice made with the head, and like all choices made purely with the head, stripped of sentiment, of loyalty, of the irrational bonds that hold communities together, it carried within it the seed of its own destruction. The hurricane. What happened next defies easy description. It can only be called a hurricane. In a country where rank and career had once taken decades to accumulate, Tukhachevsky rose so fast that even his admirers struggled to track the trajectory. Within months of joining the Red Army, he was commanding armies, not battalions, not regiments, but entire armies stretching across hundreds of miles of frozen steppe. He led the defense of the Moscow district. He commanded forces on the Eastern Front. He took charge of the Fifth Army and drove it deep into Siberia, shattering the forces of Admiral Kolchak. The white commander had at one point controlled vast stretches of Russia east of the Urals. He then turned south and played a critical role in the campaign against General Denikin. At an age when most officers were still learning how to manage a battalion, Tukhachevsky was managing the strategic destinies of entire campaigns. Foreign observers, both enemy and ally, began to notice. Who was this young Russian who fought with such terrifying speed and confidence? Who was this aristocrat in a Red Army uniform? This nobleman who had somehow become the most dangerous general on the most chaotic battlefield in the world? They called him the Red Napoleon. He did not protest the nickname. He may even have liked it. The first crack then came Warsaw. In the summer of 1920, the Red Army launched one of the most ambitious military operations in its brief and violent history, a drive westward into Poland with the goal of carrying the revolution beyond Russia's borders and into the heart of Europe. Tukhachevsky commanded the Western Front. He was 27 years old. He led his forces at a pace that shocked the world. Hundreds of miles in weeks, city after city falling, the Polish government fleeing in panic. And then, outside Warsaw, the advance stopped. The Polish forces, reorganized and inspired by a commander named Józef Pilsudski, struck the exposed flanks of the Red Army with a counterattack of devastating precision. The blow was catastrophic. The campaign that had seemed on the verge of rewriting the map of Europe collapsed within days. Tukhachevsky's forces retreated in disorder. The dream of a European revolution died in the mud outside Warsaw. The defeat had many causes, but one cause which Tukhachevsky would never forget and which would echo through the remaining 17 years of his life was this: the forces on his southern flank, commanded by the 1st Cavalry Army, had not moved when ordered. They had not provided the support that the operational plan required. The commander responsible for coordinating that southern flank was a man named Joseph Stalin. The reserves did not come. The attack failed. The armistice was signed. Tukhachevsky never forgot Warsaw, and Stalin never forgot that Tukhachevsky never forgot. In the winter of 1918, a 25-year-old nobleman had made a choice with his head, not his heart. He had chosen the side he believed would build a stronger Russia. He had given that side everything he had: his genius, his loyalty, his years. What neither he nor anyone else could know on that winter day was that the same ruthless logic that had made him choose the Bolsheviks would one day be turned against him by a system that feared independent genius more than it feared any foreign enemy, and by a man with a very long memory and a very sharp knife. The legend was born. The clock had already started. The guns went silent. The Civil War ended. And for most men who had survived it, the exhausted commissars, the hollow-eyed infantry commanders, the cavalry officers still smelling of smoke and horse sweat, the end of the fighting meant one thing above all else: rest. They had earned it. Russia had been at war for nearly a decade. The Great War against Germany and Austria-Hungary, then the Revolution, then 3 years of brutal civil conflict across a country that spanned 11 time zones. The army that had won was not a polished professional force. It was a collection of survivors bound together by ideology and necessity, held in formation by sheer will. Now at last, it could exhale. Mikhail Tukhachevsky did not exhale. While his colleagues celebrated, he was already working. While other commanders enjoyed the privileges of peacetime rank, the apartments, the receptions, the ceremonial parades, Tukhachevsky was sitting at his desk in the hours before dawn, surrounded by military manuals in 4 languages, filling notebooks with diagrams and calculations and the kind of restless, forward-leaning thinking that has no patience for the present because it is already living in the future. The question that consumed him was not how did we win. That question was already answered, already becoming mythology, already being turned into monument and slogan. The question Tukhachevsky could not stop asking was far more dangerous. How will the next war be fought? And the answer terrified him. The man who looked backward. To understand what Tukhachevsky was building, you first have to understand what he was building against. The Soviet military establishment of the 1920s was dominated by men who had made their names on horseback. Semyon Budyonny, legendary commander of the 1st Cavalry Army, a man with a walrus mustache and the instincts of a natural fighter, believed with total sincerity that the horse was still the decisive instrument of modern war. He had watched cavalry charges break enemy lines in the Civil War. He had seen what a mass of mounted men could do to demoralized infantry. He was a hero, genuinely beloved by soldiers who had fought under him, and his convictions were not stupidity. They were the honest conclusions of a man whose entire experience of warfare had been built on the power of shock, speed, and mounted mass. Kliment Voroshilov held similar views, with the added dimension that he had Stalin's ear and Stalin's trust. Where Budyonny was a warrior who happened to be suspicious of theory, Voroshilov was a politician who had learned to wear a general's uniform. Together they represented something more powerful than simple military conservatism. They represented the ideological weight of the revolution itself. The cavalry had been the strike force of Bolshevik victory. To question the cavalry was, in their minds, to question the revolution. Tukhachevsky questioned the cavalry. He did it not loudly, not theatrically, not with the kind of righteous public confrontation that would have made enemies overnight. He did it the way all truly dangerous intellectual revolutions happen, through argument, through doctrine, through the patient accumulation of evidence that the world had already changed and most people simply had not noticed. His argument was straightforward and devastating. The next major war would not be decided by horses. It would not be decided by infantry charges or even by artillery barrages of the kind that had turned the Western Front into a moonscape. It would be decided by machines, and by the minds capable of coordinating those machines across vast distances with a speed and integration that no army in the world had yet achieved. He was right. He was also in the Soviet military establishment of the 1920s, almost completely alone. The theory that changed everything. The idea that Tukhachevsky developed over the course of the late 1920s and early 1930s was called the theory of deep operations, glubokaya operatsiya in Russian. Its logic was elegant and radical in equal measure. Every military doctrine before it had operated on a basic assumption. You defeat the enemy by breaking his front line, you push against his positions, you overwhelm his forward defenses, you grind through until resistance collapses. This was attritional warfare, slow, enormously costly, and ultimately determined by which side could absorb more punishment before breaking. The First World War had demonstrated where this logic led. 4 years, tens of millions dead, and lines that moved by miles rather than hundreds of kilometers. Tukhachevsky's insight was that this entire framework was obsolete. A modern enemy was not just a front line. A modern enemy was a system. Interconnected layers of command, supply, reserve units, communications networks, transport infrastructure, and psychological cohesion. The front line was merely the face of that system, the surface layer. Destroy only the front line, and the system would regenerate. Find a way to attack the entire system simultaneously, to strike the front, the rear, the flanks, the command centers, the supply lines, and the reserves all at once, and the enemy would not bend. He would shatter. The instrument for this kind of warfare was not the cavalry charge. It was the coordinated, deep, penetrating thrust of combined arms, tanks that could break through and drive into the enemy's rear at a speed his defenders could not match, aircraft that could strike his command centers and supply depots far behind the front, paratroopers who could appear from the sky to seize critical crossroads and bridges before the enemy could reinforce them, and radio communications that would allow all of these elements to coordinate in real time across distances that would have seemed fantastical to a commander of 10 years earlier. This was not the Blitzkrieg. This was what the Blitzkrieg would one day be named after, but deeper, more sophisticated, more systematically thought through than anything the German Wehrmacht would develop in the same period. The Provisional Field Regulations of 1936, the doctrinal document that encoded Tukhachevsky's ideas into official Soviet military thinking, described a way of fighting that the Germans would not formally articulate until their campaigns in Poland and France in 1939 and 1940. The Soviet Union had developed the theory of modern mobile warfare before anyone else on Earth. It had done so because one man refused to look backward. The demonstrations that stun the world theory is one thing, steel and sweat are another. Tukhachevsky understood this. A doctrine that lived only in documents was worthless. It had to be demonstrated, tested, embodied in flesh and metal, and practiced maneuver. Throughout the early 1930s, as he rose to the position of Deputy Commissar of Defense and Chief of Armaments, he drove the Red Army through a series of modernization programs that were breathtaking in their scale and ambition. The Soviet Tank Corps grew from almost nothing into one of the largest armored forces in the world. Aviation was reorganized around the principles of ground support and deep interdiction. A system of military radio communications was built that would, in theory, allow commanders to coordinate forces across hundreds of miles in real time. And in September of 1935, on the rolling plains of Ukraine outside the city of Kiev, Tukhachevsky put his entire vision on display before an audience of foreign military observers who had traveled from across Europe to watch. What they saw that week defied everything they thought they knew about what a military exercise could be. 65,000 troops, over 1,000 armored vehicles, nearly 500 aircraft operating in coordinated waves. And then, the moment that every military attaché in attendance would describe in stunned dispatches back to their governments, the paratroopers. More than 1,100 soldiers leaping from transport aircraft, filling the Ukrainian sky with parachutes, descending behind enemy lines to seize an airfield, while armor drove through the front and aircraft struck the simulated rear echelons. It was the first large-scale demonstration of combined airborne and armored warfare in history. Military observers from Britain, France, and Germany watched it happen and then sat down to write reports that all said essentially the same thing. The Soviets are building the army of the future. The German observers in particular went home and thought very carefully about what they had seen. The old cavalry marshals watched it too. They did not write admiring reports. They frowned beneath their famous mustaches, muttered about the unreliability of machines compared to horses, and made quiet notes about a certain deputy commissar who seemed to think himself rather more important than his position warranted. The genius and its price. What is remarkable, looking back from the distance of nearly a century, is not simply that Tukhachevsky was right. Many brilliant theorists are right and are forgotten. What is remarkable is the scale of his rightness, the degree to which his specific predictions, his specific prescriptions, his specific organizational blueprints proved to be accurate. He argued that future wars would be decided in depth, not at the front. True. He argued that armor and aviation must be integrated, not used separately. True. He argued that airborne forces would play a decisive role in disrupting enemy rear areas. True. He argued that radio communications were not a luxury, but the central nervous system of modern warfare, without which the most powerful army would be blind and helpless. Devastatingly true. Every single one of these truths would be confirmed in blood, beginning in the summer of 1941. But that confirmation would come at the cost of millions of lives and nearly the destruction of the entire country, because the man who had been right about all of it would be dead 4 years before the war began. The system he had built would be dismantled. The officers he had trained would be arrested, scattered, or silenced. The doctrine he had written would be classified, suppressed, treated as dangerous contamination rather than life-saving medicine. He had built the architecture of victory. The same state that would one day need that architecture was already, quietly, preparing to demolish its architect. In Moscow, behind the walls of the Kremlin, a man with a very good memory and an instinctive horror of anyone who might be too brilliant, too popular, too right, was watching. And he had already started asking questions. By the middle of the 1930s, Mikhail Tukhachevsky stood at the summit of Soviet military power. His title was Marshal of the Soviet Union, one of only 5 men in the entire country to hold that rank when it was introduced in 1935. He was Deputy Commissar of Defense. His name was spoken with reverence in the war colleges of France and Britain. German military theorists studied his published writings with the kind of concentrated attention that professionals reserve for work they recognize as superior to their own. In the United States, military observers described him as the most intellectually formidable soldier in Europe. He was 42 years old. He had built, almost from nothing, a military doctrine that would one day reshape the entire theory of modern warfare. He had overseen the creation of the largest armored force in the world. He had demonstrated before the eyes of the global military establishment that the Soviet Union was not a backward peasant state clinging to the memory of revolutionary cavalry charges. It was a superpower in the making, armed with ideas as dangerous as any weapon. And yet, the higher his star rose, the more intensely the shadows gathered around him. The men who could not forgive him, in any organization, brilliance creates resentment in proportion to its visibility. This is true in universities and corporations and governments. In Stalin's Soviet Union, a system built on absolute hierarchy, revolutionary loyalty, and the sacred mythology of the Civil War. It was true in ways that carried mortal weight. Semyon Budyonny and Kliment Voroshilov had been watching Tukhachevsky for years, and what they saw did not please them. Budyonny, the cavalry hero, the man with the famous mustache, the soldier whose portrait hung in barracks across the country, had built his entire identity on a version of warfare that Tukhachevsky had spent a decade methodically dismantling. Every tank regiment that rolled off the assembly line under Tukhachevsky's modernization program was a quiet argument against everything Budyonny believed. Every paratrooper exercise, every combined arms maneuver, every radio communications drill was a demonstration that the future of war belonged to engineers and theorists, not to horsemen. Budyonny could not counter the argument on intellectual grounds. He had a different strategy. He called Tukhachevsky a cabinet marshal, a man who had never truly led men in the field, who lived in theories and diagrams while real soldiers, men like Budyonny himself, understood war in their bones and their hands. It was not a fair characterization. Tukhachevsky had commanded armies in genuine combat, had ridden at the front during the Civil War, had experienced the chaos and terror of real battle. But fairness was not the point. The point was to establish a narrative, to plant a seed of doubt in the mind of the one man whose opinion mattered above all others. That man was Joseph Stalin. The tyrant's arithmetic. To understand what Stalin saw when he looked at Tukhachevsky, you have to understand how Stalin saw the world. For Stalin, power was not a position. It was not a title or a rank or a set of formal authorities. Power was a relationship, specifically a relationship of total dependence. The system he was building, piece by careful piece throughout the 1930s, was one in which every person of significance in Soviet life depended entirely on Stalin's favor for their position, their safety, their very existence. Ministers depended on him, generals depended on him, artists, scientists, factory directors, regional party bosses. All of them existed within a web of total contingency, where the alternative to Stalin's approval was not simply demotion or disgrace, but disappearance. Into this system, Tukhachevsky did not fit, not because he was disloyal. By all available evidence, he was genuinely committed to the Soviet project, genuinely believed in the state he was helping to build and defend, but because he was the kind of man who was valuable on his own terms. His authority derived not from Stalin's patronage, but from his own intellect, his own achievements, his own international reputation. Foreign governments praised him. Foreign military establishments studied his work. His name appeared in newspapers in Paris and London and Berlin in sentences that did not mention Stalin at all. This was, in Stalin's arithmetic, a form of insubordination, not of intent, but of fact. A man who is admired for himself is a man who cannot be fully owned. And a man who cannot be fully owned is, in a system built on total ownership, a problem that will eventually need to be solved. Stalin had reportedly remarked in private conversation, when Tukhachevsky's name was mentioned one too many times with one too many syllables of admiration, "We don't need our own Napoleon." It was a sentence that carried more information than its 7 words appeared to contain. The architecture of suspicion systems of terror do not work by accident. They work by design, and the design is always the same. Take the normal activities of an intelligent, ambitious professional and reframe each one as evidence of disloyalty. Tukhachevsky had extensive professional contacts with German military engineers and theorists developed during the period of Soviet-German military cooperation in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Cooperation that Stalin himself had authorized. These contacts were now reframed, not professional exchange, not the ordinary practice of serious military thinkers learning from foreign counterparts. Espionage, evidence of a relationship with the enemy. Tukhachevsky read Western military journals. He subscribed to publications from France, Britain, and Germany. He took seriously the intellectual work being done in military establishments abroad. This was now reframed, not the discipline of a serious strategic thinker, admiration for capitalism, dangerous foreign influence. Tukhachevsky argued consistently and forcefully that Soviet officers needed genuine scientific and technical education, not just political training, not just ideological formation, but real engineering knowledge, real mathematical competence, real understanding of the machines they were being asked to operate and command. This was now reframed, not a reasonable position about officer education, an attempt to diminish the role of the party, a suggestion that ideology was somehow insufficient, which, in the logic of a system built on ideology alone, was effectively heresy. Each reframing taken alone was absurd. Together, they formed a portrait. And once a portrait exists, once the frame has been built around a face, every new piece of information is unconsciously sorted into the categories the frame provides. The disappearing circle. The most chilling aspect of what happened to Tukhachevsky in the years before his arrest is not what happened to him directly. It is what happened to the people around him. His associates began to disappear. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic sweep that might have triggered alarm and resistance, one by one quietly with the administrative tidiness that characterized the purges at their most efficient. A subordinate commander here, a staff officer there, a theorist who had co-authored a doctrinal paper with Tukhachevsky the year before. Each disappearance was individually explainable, The man had said something imprudent. The man had a relative who had been arrested. The man had drawn attention to himself in one way or another. Individually, each case seemed like the ordinary turbulence of life in Stalin's system, where people disappeared and no one asked too loudly where they had gone. Collectively, it was a message. A slow, methodical tightening of the circle, like the gradual reduction of oxygen in a sealed room, unnoticeable from one moment to the next, but leading with absolute inevitability toward a point where breathing would become impossible. Tukhachevsky saw it. He was too intelligent not to see it. Colleagues who had survived later recalled that he became more careful, more guarded, more precise in his public statements during 1936 and into 1937. He stopped writing the kind of bold, challenging theoretical papers that had made his name. He spoke at party meetings with the formulaic language of a man who was choosing his words the way a traveler chooses his steps on ice, testing the surface before committing his weight. But there are limits to what caution can accomplish against a machine that has already decided on its conclusion. Tukhachevsky could moderate his tone. He could restrict his circle. He could be more careful about what he said and to whom he said it. What he could not do was become a different kind of man, could not make himself less brilliant, less famous, less identified with ideas that the system's guardians found threatening precisely because they were correct. He was too visible to be protected by caution, too valuable to foreign admirers to be ignored, too right about too many things to be comfortable to men who had been wrong. The spring of 1937 arrived with the usual Moscow rhythms, the slow thaw, the rivers breaking, the city preparing for the great May Day demonstrations with their banners and their marching formations and their carefully choreographed displays of unified power. In the offices of the NKVD on Lubyanka Square, a different kind of preparation was underway. The trap had been built. The paperwork had been drawn up. The witnesses, people who had already been broken and would say whatever was placed in front of them, had been prepared. All that remained was the moment to close the door. Spring in Moscow, 1937. The city was alive with the particular energy of a place that has trained itself not to notice. The metro stations gleamed with marble and chandeliers. The parks filled with families on Sunday afternoons. The newspapers published heroic accounts of production quotas exceeded, of records broken, of a nation ascending toward a future of inevitable glory. On the surface, everything was motion and optimism and the loud, relentless forward momentum of a state that had decided history was on its side. Beneath the surface, a different season was underway. In the senior levels of the Red Army, silence had replaced argument. The conferences and seminars where officers had once debated doctrine with genuine intellectual passion, where Tukhachevsky's ideas had been challenged and refined through the friction of real professional disagreement, had become exercises in careful unanimity. Men who had opinions kept them behind their teeth. Men who had once been willing to argue with a superior about a tactical question now nodded and recorded the superior's position in their notebooks without comment. The art of military thinking was being replaced by the art of military survival, and the two arts had almost nothing in common. When a senior officer walked into a room and found his colleagues slightly too quick to smile, slightly too formal in their greetings, slightly too attentive to the distance between themselves and him, he understood. He did not need to be told. The system communicated through atmosphere, through the micro-adjustments of men who had learned to measure personal risk the way a sailor measures weather, not through instruments, but through a felt sense in the skin. Tukhachevsky was surrounded by that atmosphere every day in the spring of 1937. The journey to Kuibyshev. On the 5th of May, 1937, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky was informed that he was being reassigned. The official version was administrative and unremarkable. He was to take command of the Volga Military District, headquartered in the city of Kuibyshev, the city now known as Samara, roughly 900 kilometers southeast of Moscow. In the language of Soviet bureaucracy, this was presented as a transfer, a routine redistribution of senior personnel across the military districts that covered the vast geography of the USSR. In the language of the system, it meant something else entirely. Everyone who understood how the machinery worked, and in the circles Tukhachevsky moved in, almost everyone understood, knew that reassignment to a regional military district was the standard first step in a sequence that had become grimly familiar over the preceding 2 years. You were moved away from the capital, away from your staff, away from your networks of loyalty and professional connection. You were separated from the people who knew you, the people who trusted you, the people who might, in a crisis, speak for you. You were made small, isolated, and reachable before the next step was taken. Tukhachevsky departed for Kuibyshev. He left behind the offices, the staff cars, the institutional weight of the deputy commissariat. He left behind Moscow. He did not return to it as a free man. The night of the 22nd. The arrest came on the evening of the 22nd of May. There was no drama. There was no shouting, no physical confrontation, no scene that would have looked out of place in a newspaper account. The men who came for him were correct, even courteous. The particular courtesy of a system that had learned that brutality was unnecessary when the legal and institutional framework provided complete control. They informed him that he was requested at a meeting, an official matter, a formality. The journey from Kuibyshev to Moscow was made by train. Somewhere along those 900 kilometers of track, crossing the flat immensity of the Russian steppe under a spring sky that was indifferent to everything happening beneath it, Tukhachevsky would have understood with complete clarity what the destination actually was. Not the offices of the Commissariat of Defense, not the conference rooms where strategy was debated and doctrine was written. The car that met him at the station did not belong to the Commissariat of Defense. It belonged to the NKVD. The building it took him to was on Lubyanka Square. The accusation. The charges presented to Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the man who had built the Soviet Armored Corps, the man whose paratrooper exercises had stunned the military establishments of Europe, the man whose theory of deep operations would eventually help save the country from annihilation, were these: military conspiracy against the Soviet state, espionage in the service of Germany, preparation for a coup d'etat, collaboration with foreign intelligence services to undermine the defensive capacity of the Red Army. The accusation was, by any rational standard, a work of pure fabrication. There was no conspiracy. There was no espionage. There was no coup. There was no collaboration with Germany beyond the official state-sanctioned military exchanges of the late 1920s, exchanges that Stalin himself had authorized, that had been conducted openly, that were documented in official records held by the very organizations now presenting them as proof of treason. The evidence consisted primarily of documents, some of them later revealed to be forgeries, possibly created with the assistance of German intelligence, which had its own reasons for wanting the most capable Soviet military commander removed from his position before the war that both sides knew was coming. Names appeared in these documents. Connections were asserted. A narrative was constructed, not from facts, but from the architecture of accusation itself, which in a system of total power did not require facts to function. It required only the assertion backed by the full institutional weight of the state and the absence of any mechanism through which the assertion could be challenged. There were no lawyers. There would be no independent review. There was no appeal to any authority outside the system that had generated the charges. There was only the room and the investigators and time, the mechanics of capitulation. The interrogation of Mikhail Tukhachevsky lasted from the 22nd of May until the 26th, 4 days that the investigators, with the systematic efficiency of men who had refined their methods through hundreds of previous cases, used not to establish truth but to produce a document. The techniques employed were not primarily physical. They were something more precise, more psychologically devastating, the complete destruction of the conditions that make coherent thought possible. Sleep was made a privilege rather than a necessity, something that happened in fragments, interrupted at unpredictable intervals by the resumption of questioning, so that the mind lost its ability to distinguish between sessions, lost the thread of what it had said and what it had not said, lost the clarity required to maintain a consistent account against the accumulated pressure of men who had unlimited time and a predetermined conclusion. The room was the whole world. There was nothing outside it, no colleagues, no staff, no institutional identity, no rank. The insignia had been removed, the uniform was gone, the names Tukhachevsky, Marshal, Deputy Commissar were replaced by a case number, a prisoner designation, the bureaucratic vocabulary of a system that had reduced a human being to an administrative problem awaiting resolution. And then came the argument that, in the end, no amount of intellectual resistance could fully withstand. The investigators spoke of his family, his wife, Nina, his daughter, Svetlana. The system held them. The system could reach them, had already reached them in some respects. The fate of people connected to enemies of the state was not a theoretical question in the Soviet Union of 1937. It was a documented historical pattern repeated hundreds of times in the preceding years. Wives arrested, children placed in state institutions, families erased from the social fabric with the same administrative thoroughness applied to everything else. Against this argument, the theory of deep operations offered no defense. Against this argument, a decade of military genius, of correct predictions, of demonstrated service to the state, offered nothing at all. On the 26th of May, 1937, Mikhail Tukhachevsky signed the confession. Historians who have studied the document note that his signature on subsequent pages becomes progressively less controlled. The handwriting of a man whose hand was shaking, or of a man who had moved beyond the point where the physical act of writing carried any meaning. He signed not because he believed what he was signing. He signed, as the plan of this text puts it with precise accuracy, as a philosophical capitulation, the act of a man who had calculated with the same cold intelligence he had applied to military problems his entire life. That resistance was no longer rational. He had spent his career thinking about the point at which an enemy system could be made to collapse, the moment when the entire structure of resistance gave way, not gradually, but all at once. He had written about it theoretically, clinically, as an operational problem. Now he understood it from the inside. The document existed. The machine moved forward. The next stage was not investigation. The next stage was theater, the performance of justice in a system that had already decided what justice required. In 11 days, the curtain would rise. Moscow, the 11th of June, 1937. The city woke that morning to an ordinary summer day. The sun came up over the Kremlin towers at its usual hour. Streetcars ran on their usual routes. Workers filed into factories. Children walked to school. The bread queues formed and dissolved. The enormous churning apparatus of Soviet daily life continued its rotation with the mechanical indifference of a planet that does not pause for the events occurring on its surface. In a closed room inside the building of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR, 8 men in military uniform were brought into a chamber from which the world had been completely excluded. No journalists, no observers, no family members, no public gallery, no record that would be made available to anyone outside the immediate circle of the system that had convened the proceeding. The room was sealed not just physically, but institutionally, wrapped in layers of classification and secrecy that would not begin to dissolve for decades. 8 men, the entire senior command of the Red Army, the architects of the force that stood between the Soviet Union and every external threat it faced in a world that was unmistakably and accelerating, sliding toward a new catastrophic war. At the center of the 8 sat Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the judges. The military tribunal that would decide the fate of these 8 men was itself a construction of terrible irony. Among the judges sitting in review were men who had fought alongside the accused, who had shared tables with them at command dinners, who had argued doctrine with them in seminars, who had decorated them with medals and been decorated by them in turn. The presence of these men at the tribunal was not incidental. It was designed. It served a specific purpose within the logic of the system that had assembled the proceeding. Semyon Budyonny was there. Kliment Voroshilov was there. Their presence sent a message that required no translation. The revolution was unified. The old heroes endorsed the verdict. There was no dissent within the system, no crack in the surface through which doubt might enter. The men who had once publicly disagreed with Tukhachevsky about military doctrine were now sitting in judgment of him, and their presence in those chairs was the system's way of demonstrating that disagreement had been resolved, permanently, institutionally, and without appeal. The other judges were senior military figures who understood each in his own way and with whatever private calculation he had made in the sleepless nights before this morning, that their presence here was not optional. To refuse would be to invite a question about one's own loyalties. To sit and sign was to purchase, at whatever moral cost, another season of survival in a system where survival was the primary accomplishment. They sat. They listened. They prepared to sign. The proceeding, the trial, lasted several hours. In the context of what was being decided, the lives of 8 men, the fate of the military doctrine of the largest country on earth, the question of whether the most capable military mind in Soviet history was a traitor or a patriot, several hours was an almost incomprehensible compression of time. There were no defense attorneys. In the formal structure of the proceeding, the accused had the right to speak, to respond to the charges, to address the tribunal, to place on the record whatever they wished to say. This right existed on paper. In practice, it was the right to speak into a room that had already decided before the first word was uttered what its conclusion would be. The charges were read. And the confessions, those signed documents from the weeks of interrogation, were entered into the record as the primary evidence of guilt. The accused were invited to confirm their confessions, to explain them, to add whatever context they felt relevant. Tukhachevsky spoke. The precise record of his words in that room has never been fully declassified, but accounts from the post-Stalin period drawn from partial archival access and the testimony of individuals with indirect knowledge of the proceeding converge on a consistent portrait. He was composed, he was precise. He maintained, in the circumstances of that room, a bearing that the investigators who had spent weeks trying to break him had not managed to eliminate. There are accounts suggesting he acknowledged the signed confession while making clear, in the careful language of a man choosing every word with the knowledge that it would be his last, that the document did not represent the truth of what he had done or intended. His reported final statement to the tribunal, rendered in various versions across the historical literature but consistent in its core, was something close to this. I served this country. I fought for it. Everything else is invention. It was not an argument that the tribunal was designed to consider. The verdict, the deliberation such as it was, took minutes. The verdict for all 8 defendants was identical. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was the same for all 8. The highest measure of punishment to be carried out immediately. In the legal vocabulary of the Soviet system, immediately meant within 24 hours of sentencing. In practice, on that night of the 11th of June, 1937, it meant within hours. The 8 men, Tukhachevsky, Yakir, Uborovich, Kork, Eidemann, Feldman, Primakov, and Putna, were taken from the courtroom and executed before the Moscow night was over. The men who had built the Red Army, who had conceived its doctrine, who had organized its armored corps and its aviation and its communication systems, who had conducted the exercises that had drawn the admiring reports of military observers from across the civilized world, were gone. The paperwork was filed. The case was closed. The city that did not know. While the military collegium was in session, Moscow continued its day. Somewhere in the city, a factory shift ended and another began. Somewhere a family sat down to an evening meal. Somewhere a child finished homework and was told to go to sleep. Somewhere a couple walked along the embankment of the Moscow River in the long June evening light, watching the reflections of the bridges in the water, speaking about things that had nothing to do with what was happening in a closed room on the other side of the city. This was the quality that made the terror so total and so disorienting to those who lived through it and tried, afterward, to explain it to people who had not. It was invisible. It happened in sealed rooms in the administrative vocabulary of case numbers and procedural classifications. The city that was its setting did not experience it as an event. There was no explosion, no confrontation, no public moment around which memory could organize itself. There was only the absence afterward of people who had been present before. Within days, the official account appeared in the Soviet press. A conspiracy of military traitors had been uncovered and liquidated. The state was safe. The revolution had defended itself against those who sought to betray it from within. The story was brief, final, and written in the passive voice of official announcement. The grammatical form designed to suggest that events occur through the natural operation of historical forces, rather than through the decisions of specific men. The portraits of the 8 defendants came down from the walls of military institutions across the country. Their names were removed from the buildings and units they had commanded. Their published works, the doctrinal papers, the operational studies, the training manuals, were removed from circulation, classified or destroyed. The theory of deep operations, the most sophisticated military doctrine developed anywhere in the world in the first half of the 20th century, was quietly buried. In the military academies, instructors who had spent years teaching Tukhachevsky's concepts to the next generation of Soviet officers faced a practical problem. The doctrine was correct, and everyone who had studied it knew it was correct, but the man who had formulated it was now an enemy of the people, and teaching his ideas was indistinguishable in the logic of the system from endorsing his treachery. So the ideas were taught without the name. The concepts survived in fragmentary, unofficial, unacknowledged form, passed between officers the way contraband is passed, quietly and with the awareness that possession carried risk. The arithmetic of destruction. The purge of the Red Army that Tukhachevsky's case inaugurated, or perhaps more accurately, that his case symbolized and anchored, was one of the most catastrophic acts of institutional self-destruction in the history of modern warfare. By the end of 1938, 3 of 5 marshals of the Soviet Union had been executed. 13 of 15 army commanders were gone. 50 of 57 corps commanders were gone. 154 of 186 divisional commanders were gone. The officer corps of the Red Army, the generation that had been trained in Tukhachevsky's doctrine, that had participated in the Kiev exercises, that had read the operational studies and understood how a modern combined arms force was supposed to function, had been effectively destroyed. What remained was an army that possessed the equipment Tukhachevsky had built, the tanks, the aircraft, the radio systems, the parachute units, but had been stripped of the human beings who knew how to use them as a coordinated, integrated instrument of modern warfare. The trap had closed on one man, but the jaws reached much further than one man. 4 years later, in the first catastrophic weeks of a war that everyone had known was coming, the full cost of that reach would be paid, not by the men who had built the trap, but by the millions who had nothing to do with any of it. The bill for the 11th of June, 1937, would be submitted in the summer of 1941, and it would be enormous. Sunday, the 22nd of June, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, along a front stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the German Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border in the largest military operation in the history of human warfare. More than 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft. The full coordinated weight of the most battle-tested, doctrinally sophisticated military machine in the world, directed against a country that had spent the preceding 4 years systematically destroying the men most capable of defending it. What happened in the weeks that followed was a catastrophe of a scale and speed that stunned even the Germans who were inflicting it. Soviet armies collapsed not because they lacked equipment. They had more tanks than the Germans. They had more aircraft. They had the vast territorial depth and the enormous population reserves that had saved Russia in every previous crisis of its long, violent history. What they lacked, what had been taken from them with administrative thoroughness in the years between 1937 and 1941, was the human architecture required to make those resources function as a coherent military system. The radio communications broke down in the first hours because the officers trained to maintain them under combat conditions were gone. The armored units that should have concentrated and counterattacked instead dispersed and were destroyed piecemeal because the commanders who understood how to mass armor for deep penetration had been arrested or shot. The aviation, which should have struck German supply lines and command centers far behind the front, flew in uncoordinated waves that the Luftwaffe destroyed with systematic efficiency because the doctrine of integrated air-ground operations had been buried along with its author's name. The German generals who directed that catastrophic opening campaign were not geniuses operating from wholly original insight. They were professionals who had studied the available literature of modern warfare, including the Soviet operational studies of the 1930s, including the reports their own military observers had written after watching the Kiev exercises of 1935. They had learned from Tukhachevsky's published work and from the demonstration of his ideas and practice exactly how a combined arms force conducting deep operations could shatter an enemy's entire defensive system in days rather than months. They used his theory against his country, and his country, having killed him, had no one left who fully understood how to answer it. The long return. The recovery did not happen in a single moment of revelation. It happened the way all genuine learning happens, slowly, painfully, through the accumulation of experience that costs far more than any book. In the desperate defensive battles of the autumn and winter of 1941, Soviet commanders began, by necessity, to rediscover principles that had been classified and buried, not because they found Tukhachevsky's papers. Those remained inaccessible, but because the logic of combined arms warfare is not arbitrary. It derives from the physical realities of how machines and men move and communicate and support each other on a modern battlefield. A sufficiently intelligent commander, given enough time and enough catastrophic failure, will eventually arrive at the same conclusions that a sufficiently intelligent theorist would derive from first principles. Georgy Zhukov at Moscow in the winter of 1941, Konstantin Rokossovsky at Stalingrad in 1942, Alexander Vasilevsky under the frozen skies of the Don Steppe. These men were not reading from Tukhachevsky's manuals. They were rebuilding from the ruins of repeated disaster and understanding of warfare that he had already written down a decade earlier. The process was not efficient. It was not clean. It cost in lives and territory and suffering, a price that is almost impossible to comprehend from the distance of nearly a century. Historians who have studied the military effectiveness of the Red Army across the full arc of the war consistently note the same pattern. The army that fought in the summer of 1941 and the army that fought in the summer of 1944 were, in doctrinal terms, almost unrecognizably different. The later army was faster, more coordinated, more capable of the kind of deep, simultaneous, multi-echelon operations that Tukhachevsky had theorized. It had learned, at catastrophic cost, what he had tried to teach for free: Operation Bagration. In the summer of 1944, the Red Army launched an offensive that military historians rank among the most operationally sophisticated military operations of the entire Second World War. Operation Bagration targeted Army Group Center, the central German formation on the Eastern Front. With a simultaneous attack across a front of nearly 1,000 kilometers, designed not to push the Germans back but to envelop, encircle, and destroy entire army groups in detail before they could withdraw to prepared positions. The operation combined armored breakthrough forces driving deep into the German rear, aviation striking command centers and supply lines, airborne and partisan operations disrupting German communications, and carefully sequenced follow-on forces that exploited the gaps created by the initial penetrations before the enemy could respond coherently. It was, in its essential architecture, the theory of deep operations translated from paper into steel and fire. The planning documents that governed Operation Bagration drew on doctrinal work developed in Soviet military academies from the early 1940s onward. work that had, quietly and without official acknowledgement, recovered and rebuilt the framework that Tukhachevsky had constructed and the purges had buried. The men who planned it had not been taught by him directly, but they had been taught by his ideas, which had survived their author's destruction the way a river survives a drought. Underground, invisible, but flowing nonetheless, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to emerge again. Army Group Center was effectively destroyed in 6 weeks. It was one of the largest single defeats suffered by Germany in the entire war. The ideas of a man who had been dead for 7 years helped accomplish what a living army could not accomplish, with 3 years of brutal experience and the largest industrial mobilization in human history alone. His ideas won a war he never lived to see, the rehabilitation. In 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The system that had been built around his absolute authority began almost immediately to show the cracks that absolute authority had been holding together by force. Nikita Khrushchev, navigating the treacherous transition of power, found in the legacy of the purges both a political weapon against his rivals and a genuine, if incomplete, moral accounting with the past. In 1956, at the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered the speech that became known as the Secret Speech, a partial but devastating inventory of Stalin's crimes, including the destruction of the Red Army's command cadre in the years before the most dangerous war in Soviet history. In 1957, 20 years after the closed proceeding in the military collegium, the case of Mikhail Tukhachevsky and his 7 co-defendants was formally reviewed. The verdict of 1937 was overturned. The official determination used the careful bureaucratic language of Soviet legal rehabilitation. The conviction was annulled for the absence of elements of crime in the actions of the convicted. In the compressed vocabulary of Soviet administrative prose, this sentence contained an admission of extraordinary weight. There had been no conspiracy. There had been no espionage. There had been no coup. There had been nothing except a man who was too brilliant to write and too visible in a system that had decided those qualities were more dangerous than any foreign army. Tukhachevsky's works were returned to the military academies. His name was spoken again in the corridors of the institutions he had helped create. Monuments were erected, streets were named. The official machinery of Soviet memory, which had erased him with such thoroughness in 1937, now worked with equal thoroughness to restore a version of him, inevitably incomplete, inevitably shaped by the ideological requirements of the moment, but present again in the public record of the country he had served, and that had killed him. What remains today? The theory of deep operations, the intellectual achievement of a young Russian aristocrat who taught himself military science in a German prisoner of war camp and spent the rest of his short life trying to give his country the army it would need to survive, is studied in military academies on every inhabited continent. The United States Army's doctrine of air-land battle, developed in the 1980s as a conceptual framework for fighting Soviet forces in Europe, drew explicitly on the theory of deep operations. The operational concepts that governed coalition warfare in the Gulf in 1991, the deep simultaneous attack on the entire Iraqi military system, rather than a sequential grinding down of its front lines, were recognizable descendants of the ideas Tukhachevsky had written down in his Moscow apartment in the late 1920s. Military theorists in China, in Israel, in Germany, in Britain have all engaged seriously with the conceptual framework he built. His name stands in the literature of military theory alongside Clausewitz, alongside Sun Tzu, alongside the small number of human beings who thought about organized violence with enough clarity and originality to permanently change how it is understood and practiced. He was 44 years old when he was killed. He had been a marshal for 2 years. He had spent his entire adult life, from the moment he walked out of a German prisoner of war camp in 1917 until the moment they led him into a room in Moscow from which he did not return, thinking about how to make a state strong enough to survive in a world that offered no guarantees. The state survived. The ideas survived. The man did not. And that is perhaps the most precise summary of what it means to be a genius. in a system that fears genius, that your ideas are too useful to be permanently destroyed, even by the people who destroy you, that the work outlasts the worker, that the future you imagine, that you labored and argued and fought and ultimately died for, arrives eventually, just not for you. Tukhachevsky never saw the summer of 1944. He never watched the army he had designed, rebuilt at terrible cost from the ruins of his own murder, finally move across the European plain with the devastating, coordinated, deep, and simultaneous power he had spent his life describing. But the army moved, the operation worked. The country he had chosen, with his head, not his heart, was saved. Even the most ruthless system cannot kill an idea whose time has come. It can only kill the man who thought of it first.